Yesterday it was announced that Sony's going to be releasing the PlayStation Classic, which is going to be a console that pretty much follows in the footsteps of what Nintendo's been doing with the NES Mini and the SNES Mini, where they're going to be putting out a little mini PS1 kind of looking system that has 20 games built into it with HDMI ports, upscaled properly, 2 controllers. It's sort of like a throwback to the original PlayStation 1. And so I was like, wow, that's pretty cool, because a lot of the people nowadays never got to play the PS1 library. I know people whose first console was a PS2, and yes, you could play PS1 on games on there, but not everybody had them. Now, they're going to pick 20 games, and we don't know all the games yet that they're going to put on there, and release this thing so we can all go back and play these games over again. So I was thinking, you know what? I have such fond memories of the PlayStation 1 era, because you got to understand, that system came out, it came out when I was a kid, but it didn't get big. It didn't become the top dog until I was a teenager. The PS1 was the system of that era, for a very long time. And then the PS2 came along and just, exceeded expectations. PS2 is an amazing system. But I wanted to talk about the PlayStation 1 and kind of my memories of it. Now, what I'm probably going to do is I'm probably going to end up doing a whole podcast over on the Geekdom 101 podcast, which is geekdom101.libsyn.com, probably over an hour long, where myself and a guest, probably Mr. Eddie from Pixels and Bits, we're going to be discussing the classic PlayStation era. I think that would be a fun little show for myself and Ed to do, but I haven't figured out who's going to be the guest on it yet, but I think he'll be my first choice. In the meantime, though, I want to give you all kind of some of my PlayStation memories. So the PS1's game library was incredible. I mean, even to this day, the PlayStation 1 has one of the most impressive and effective video game libraries ever, because it had everything. I feel like when we got to PS3 and 360, I feel like it became there was too much of a focus on first-person shooters, and everything became a first-person or a third-person shooter. And even though I like some of those games, it gets annoying seeing the same thing over and over again. With the PlayStation 1, you had so much variety of games. PlayStation 1 had so many incredible JRPGs, and I love JRPGs. PlayStation 1 had an incredibly impressive collection of fighting games. There were arcade ports that were not perfect, but relatively good for its time on the PS1. PlayStation 1 had incredible survival horror games. It didn't really, PS1 wasn't the first system to have survival horror games, but it definitely was the one that popularized it with Resident Evil and, of course, later on, Silent Hill and the Resident Evil sequels, which to me are all good. PS1 had a lot of really, really great driving games. And I don't just mean like Grand Theft Auto 1 and 2 or Driver, but I mean like Gran Turismo was one of the highest selling games. Actually, I think it's the highest selling PS1 game ever. You also had Ridge Racer. Ridge Racer is amazing. Jet Moto. There are so many classic games on that PS1, and I have so many fond memories. And even though the graphics definitely look dated, the old 3D models just don't look as good as the stuff that's out now, obviously. I have such warm nostalgia and warm feelings for that PS1. So I want to give y'all a little bit of a memory, trip through memory lane about my memories as a PS1 kid, and then you can leave your comments down below. But like I said, I'm going to do a whole podcast on this and go even more in depth. So the whole reason why I even jumped over to PS1 was because of Final Fantasy VII. And I know I'm not the only one. Final Fantasy 4 and 6 are two of the best games ever made for the Super Nintendo. I absolutely adore those two games, and when they came over to the US, they were called Final Fantasy 2 and 3 back then. But if you were a gaming fan and you were keeping up with the magazines back then, you knew that it was basically 4 and 6. So when 7 came out, it confused some people because they're like, wait a minute, where's 4 through 6? But, because it was like 1, 2, 3, 7. But I knew what was going on. And the talk for a long time is that the Final Fantasy VII was going to end up being on the Nintendo Ultra 64, is what it was called. So I remember I bought a 64 because I was a Nintendo kid. I had Super Nintendo, Nintendo, and Game Boy, so I bought a 64, and I love my 64. But then what wound up happening is we found out that because of the storage problems with the 64's cartridge-based systems, at that time they couldn't hold the massive game that Final Fantasy VII would end up being. they had to put the system or put the game on a different system, and that was the PS1. Now, the PS1 prior to Final Fantasy VII was already gaining some momentum. It had games like Tekken, which was really PS1, even though Sega Saturn technically did it first, and in some ways Sega CD kind of did it even before that, but PS1 was really the place to be as far as 3D fighting games went. You know, you didn't really see any of them on Super Nintendo, and N64 wasn't really well known for its fighting games. There was a few, but that's not really what the system was truly played for. With the PS1, you had games like Tekken, Battle Arena Toshinden, which is a really old, one of the early PS1 games. You know, you had another game called Tobal Number One, which is like an RPG fighting game that Akira Toriyama, the creator of Dragon Ball, did art for. Another very underrated game, I felt. And I feel like, you know, with the PS1, like, there were so many options out there. It was like when Sega did the Sega CD, they had some good games on there, but they put too much of a focus on these cinematic cutscene games. And what they did with the PlayStation was Sony made deals with all the major companies, Capcom, Konami, Square, to produce quality games. And that's why we wound up with things like Metal Gear Solid, which revolutionized the entire Metal Gear series. I mean, it was around back then, but it's almost like Metal Gear Solid is like Final Fantasy VII in that people knew about the games, but Metal Gear Solid and Final Fantasy VII put those franchises in the mainstream with casual gamers. That's the way that I remember it, and because they're both good games. I mean, Final Fantasy VII is not my favorite Final Fantasy by all means. In fact, I feel like in some ways it's very overrated by a lot of people, but it is a great game. I think it is a great game, and it is one that worked in hooking people. Then you had Resident Evil, which was, you know, you had that. Then you had Resident Evil 2, which is, again, a great game. You had Dino Crisis and Silent Hill, which was Resident Evil, but even scarier. You know, the survival horror genre worked because it's hard to explain, but those weird kind of, like low, not low budget, but those kind of, you know, late 90s 3D models, because of how, like, bootleg they looked, it almost made the game look scarier, as weird as that might sound. So, anyways, I told my dad to get me a PlayStation 1 for Christmas. I think it was Christmas of 97, but I could be wrong on that. It might have been earlier. And I remember he got me a PlayStation. He got me two games, Final Fantasy VII and NBA Hang Time. And it's interesting because NBA Hang Time is a game that I used to rent all the time from Blockbuster. And by the way, when we do the 1 hour podcast or whatever, we're going to talk a lot about Blockbuster because that was like the place to rent games. I mean, now we have Redbox, but Blockbuster had a lot, including Dragon Ball GT Final Bout, which was the first Dragon Ball game that I ever played. First one I ever played. I never played Dragon Power when it was out back in the day, but I did play GT Final Bout, that rare English version. I did play that, and I rented it from Blockbuster, and somebody stole it. But anyways, so I told my dad to give me the game, and it's funny because NBA Hang Time, I couldn't find NBA Hang Time on PS1. Like, that's a very rare game. It's out there, but I remember for years I was looking for Hang Time for PS1, and I couldn't find it. Now, I do own it on 64 now, which is a good version of the game. I love that version. Can't say anything bad about it. But I was wondering whatever happened to the game. But it was funny because I got my copy of Final Fantasy VII, and I couldn't save my game because my dad, who obviously was an older guy, not really into video games, didn't really understand, and this is kind of a new thing at the time, he didn't know what a memory card was. You have to understand that memory cards were like a new thing because Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Sega, Game Boy, they all had like these built-in battery packs so you could save your games inside the cartridge, like Zelda, whatever. But PlayStation was a CD game, and it was a CD-ROM, not a CD-RAM. You couldn't save onto the disc. It wouldn't work anyways if you tried. So they had these memory cards. Now, memory cards were first invented, I think, for the Neo Geo. I think they were the first system to do it, but I could be wrong on that. It could be TurboGrafx. I mean, I don't know. But it was really important during this time to have memory cards for all your games for PS1. And I had to explain to my dad that I needed the memory card to save my game, or else the PS1 was going to be on 24 hours a day, and that was going to be bad because if the power went out, I lost everything. You got to have a memory card. So it sucks because he had to return Hang Time. So he returned Hang Time, got me the memory card, and I was able to play Final Fantasy VII. But I didn't care because Final Fantasy VII was the reason I bought that system. And then I discovered a whole bunch of other games. I mean, as the series started getting bigger and I started making more friends and I started to talk to them about their games, there are so many memories I have of that PS1, dude. Like, I could do a million videos on this. I remember playing Jet Moto 2, loving Jet Moto, love that game. I remember renting Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, and then I wound up buying the game because I loved it so much, both of them. I remember playing Tekken 3. Tekken 2 was like great, but Tekken 3 was like my shit. Like, I love Tekken 3. And just unlocking all the characters, going through the different story modes and like getting Dr. B and Gon and all that. That was just so awesome. Like, they had so many different story modes, or so many different modes in that game to play. Loved that game. They released X-Men vs. Street Fighter, which I absolutely loved, the arcade version. They have X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, and Marvel vs. Capcom, and I had all three of them on PS1. And man, the hours we plugged into those games. They weren't perfect because you couldn't tag in and out. You had to wait for your guy to lose and you bring the other guy in, which was, again, it kind of takes away from what the arcade game really promised. Didn't matter. The graphics looked great, looked amazing. It was all we had and we had fun with it. Same thing with another game I used to play a lot. I mean, I played the shit out of was Siphon Filter. Siphon Filter, like Metal Gear Solid was probably the best kind of espionage game on the system, but I think Siphon Filter's right up there. Like, it's probably right below Metal Gear Solid. I love that game. And then there's Twisted Metal, Mario Kart with an attitude. Love that freaking game so much. Just so many classic characters. Sweet Tooth was kind of like the PlayStation, or one of the PlayStation's big mascots. And then we got the actual mascots, which would be Crash and Spyro. And the thing about Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon is that when those games came out, it was kind of like Sony was telling Nintendo, like, hey, you've been the king of platformers for years. And they are, unquestionably. But we've got our own. In fact, the commercials for Crash Bandicoot was some dude dressed up like him going to, like, Nintendo headquarters with a megaphone, like, talking shit. Like, I don't know if y'all remember that, if you were around back then. The idea was that they were trying to unseat Nintendo as the king of platformers, which really they didn't really do, because Nintendo still has the most iconic video game characters. But Spyro and Crash both turned out to be quality freaking games that are getting re-releases very soon. I think one of them's already out. But even before that, you had Tomb Raider, and Lara Croft was another big mascot for Sony, because there were no Tomb Raider games on Nintendo systems. And the first Tomb Raider was such a cool game, because it was sort of like, it had platforming elements, obviously, but it had, like, I don't even know what the genre would even be called, but it was sort of like how you go through and you have to find caverns and explore and find things and move on to the next. Like, what a fun game that was, and a little annoying, but the first Tomb Raider was cool. Really a game that I think that game helped put Sony on the map, the PlayStation, but also PlayStation helped put Lara Croft on the map, and she became an iconic video game character. I mean, there's movies, several of them based on Lara Croft, so probably because of her boobs, but hey, it's whatever. That's another game from that era. There's just so many classic games. I mean, there's so many RPGs. Breath of Fire 3 and 4, Dragon Quest 7 or Dragon Warrior 7, Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9 were on that system. Star Ocean, The Second Story, Legend of Dragoon. It's just endless. And then you had RPG Maker. Then you had the Street Fighter collection. Then you had Mega Man X4, Mega Man X5. I love those two games. Mega Man 8. Sony had such an unbelievable freaking library of games. I could sit here and rattle off like 50 of them for you, but you probably already know. And I had so much fun playing Japanese games on the system, because I had to get the little Game Shark and the little Spring to swap them out. So I got to play Dragon Ball Z Legends, Ultimate Battle 22, and GT Final Bout on there, the Japanese versions. I got to play a bootleg version of Thrill Kill, which was an unreleased game. Go look up Thrill Kill if you don't know what I'm talking about. It's an unfinished, super violent fighting game that's just super sexualized and super violent. Not for kids, and it was never finished from what I understand, but it's still playable. That was a big title. Also, the sports games, too, were pretty cool. You had, obviously, games like Blitz, which were big back then, but you also had, like, I remember playing, I remember the one I liked was NFL Game Day. I loved NFL Game Day. I actually was into hockey for a year. Believe it or not, some people who know me are shocked to hear that probably. I liked hockey for a year, and I used to play NHL Face-Off 98, and I think I picked the Detroit Red Wings. So many memories of just playing these sports games. Like, there's just so much good stuff on that system that these 20 games coming out for the PS Classic are just not going to be able to cover everything. It's just not going to happen. It's not going to be a thing. So, yeah. Anyways, I will be covering more of this in the future because I have a lot. I mean, I might do like individual memories of like Tekken and things like that because there's so much to talk about when it comes to this. But let me know your memories down below of some of your favorite games and kind of how you got into PS1. I have so many stories, but I'll save them for the podcast. Let me know what you think. Love you guys. Hope you have a great rest of your day. And let me know if you're going to get the PS Classic. I'm going to wait and see what games are going to be on there. Because I've still got my PS1 games. Most of them. So, but let's see. Let's see if they bring in some rarities or something. Maybe I'll check it out. But again, the HDMI kind of sells it for me too. Anyways, that's it. Talk to you soon.